In a quiet, unassuming town, Mira thought she had found the fresh start she so desperately needed. But what seemed like a peaceful escape quickly turned into a nightmare when she unknowingly became the obsession of a man whose mind had already begun to unravel. As the walls closed in around her, Mira realized that no matter how far she ran, she could never outrun the darkness that had followed her. In this chilling tale of obsession, humiliation, and revenge, one question remains: how far will someone go to make another person feel their pain? In the quiet, sleepy town of Harrowsville, where everyone seemed to know everyone else's business, there was a darkness lurking just beneath the surface. The kind of darkness that people didn't talk about until it was too late. Mira was new to the town, a young woman with a mysterious past, trying to start fresh. She had recently moved from the city, hoping that Harrowsville's peacefulness would help her leave behind the chaos she had known. Mira quickly became popular among the townsfolk, admired for her beauty, charm, and infectious laugh. She had a way of making people feel like they were the most important person in the room. But one person didn't share the same opinion: Thomas. He was a quiet, withdrawn man who had lived in Harrowsville his entire life. He worked as a mechanic, spent most of his time alone, and had few friends. People considered him strange, aloof, and out of touch with the rest of the world. Thomas didn't think much of Mira at first. He had seen many people come and go in this town, but something about her was different. At first it was just curiosity. He watched her from afar, noticing how everyone seemed to gravitate toward her. But as time passed, that curiosity grew into something darker, an obsession. Mira became the center of his thoughts, and soon he couldn't shake the feeling that she was everything he could never be. Popular, loved, successful, everything he wanted but could never have. He began following her, watching her every move. He was always just out of sight, hidden in the shadows, observing as she went about her daily life. He knew when she went to the grocery store, when she attended yoga classes, even when she went for her evening walks. His obsession grew, and with it, his resentment. He started to believe that Mira thought she was better than everyone, that she looked down on him like the rest of the town did. Mira, however, remained oblivious to Thomas' growing obsession. She continued living her life as if nothing was amiss. She had no reason to suspect that someone in the town might harbor such dark feelings toward her. It wasn't until the party that everything changed. The gathering was small, just a few people from town getting together for drinks and music. Mira had been invited by one of her friends, and she decided to attend, unaware that Thomas had also been invited. The night started off like any other party, with laughter and conversation filling the room. But everything shifted when Mira made a comment that would haunt her forever. It was a light-hearted joke, a casual remark to her friends, but it struck a chord with Thomas. In front of everyone, Mira made fun of him. She didn't even realize she had done it. It was just a joke, a harmless comment that she thought would go unnoticed. But for Thomas, it was the final straw. The bitterness inside him festered, and something inside him snapped. He felt humiliated, belittled, and rejected. His resentment toward her exploded in that moment, and the plan he had been unknowingly building in his mind for weeks began to take shape. Mira had no idea what was coming. The days following the party were quiet for Mira, but a strange unease lingered. She tried to dismiss it, but every time she saw Thomas, that feeling returned, nagging at her. He hadn't said much during their brief encounter in the park, but his cold stare haunted her thoughts. She started noticing his presence more often, standing in the corner of the coffee shop, sitting in the back of the library, or just hanging around town with an eerie stillness. She couldn't figure out what it was, but something about the way he watched her made her skin crawl. Mira tried to brush it off as her imagination, but the strange feeling never quite left. She continued to run her usual route through the park, trying to keep a sense of normalcy. However, even her evening jogs no longer felt safe. Thomas had begun to appear at odd times, standing off in the distance, as if waiting for her to pass by. His stare was unwavering, and the distance between them felt like it was closing in with each encounter. He never approached her, but his presence was always there, like a shadow she couldn't escape. She tried telling herself it wasn't a big deal. After all, Harrowsville was a small town and it was easy to run into people. But something felt wrong. His eyes, cold and empty, followed her everywhere. She couldn't ignore the creeping sense that something darker was at play. But what could she do? She was just another person in a town full of strangers. How could anyone take her seriously? Then, one evening, as Mira was jogging through the park, she saw him again. This time he was standing right in the middle of the path, his figure blocking her way. Her heart skipped a beat. She tried to keep running, but her legs froze as their eyes met. It was an odd, almost surreal moment, as if time had slowed. There was no hint of recognition or warmth in his gaze, just an unsettling stillness. He didn't say a word as she came closer, but his eyes followed her every step. She tried to sidestep him, but he moved with an unnatural calm, positioning himself directly in her path. For a split second, Mira thought about turning back, but she was already too close. Her pulse quickened as she stood face to face with him, unsure of what he was thinking. Finally, he stepped aside without a word and disappeared into the trees. The encounter left Mira shaken, but she brushed it off. She couldn't let herself become paranoid. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that Thomas wasn't just another lonely man in town. Something about him was different, and his gaze lingered in her mind long after she had passed him. Mira's unease grew stronger as the days went by. She couldn't understand what was happening. Thomas's strange behavior had intensified. He no longer just watched from a distance, he followed her. Sometimes she would spot him in the background while she was out running errands or picking up coffee. Other times he was even closer, lingering in the same aisle at the grocery store or sitting in the same section of the library. She couldn't escape him. She tried to brush off the encounters as coincidences, but deep down, Mira knew it wasn't just her imagination. It felt like Thomas was always there, waiting, watching, and following her every move. The idea that someone was stalking her made her feel powerless. There was nowhere to hide. He was always one step behind, just out of reach, never saying a word, but always there. And every time she saw him, it felt like the walls of her life were closing in. One evening, after a long day at the cafe, Mira was walking home when she saw Thomas again. His car was parked at the end of the street, its engine running. Mira's heart rate quickened as she recognized the familiar figure sitting in the driver's seat. Thomas wasn't just in the background anymore, he was actively pursuing her. She picked up her pace, her footsteps echoing in the quiet street as she tried to shake the feeling of being hunted. Her breath came in shallow bursts as she glanced over her shoulder. The car had started to follow her, keeping a slow, steady pace just behind her. Panic surged through her as she realized that he wasn't going to stop. She turned sharply down a side street, hoping to lose him, but when she glanced behind her again, the car was still there, tailing her like a shadow. Mira's heart raced as she broke into a sprint. Her legs felt heavy, and every time she turned a corner, she feared she would see the car right behind her. She couldn't outrun him forever, but she had to try. Her feet hit the pavement faster, faster, until she finally reached her doorstep and slammed the door behind her, heart hammering in her chest. That night, Mira locked all the windows and doors, but sleep didn't come. She lay awake, listening to every creak and groan of the house. The fear of being followed lingered, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. What did Thomas want from her? Why couldn't he just leave her alone? The next few days were a blur of fear and anxiety. Mira was unable to focus on anything for long. She was always looking over her shoulder, always aware of the eyes that seemed to be following her every move. The encounters with Thomas continued, but now they felt more intense. He wasn't just lurking in the background anymore, he was actively tracking her, showing up wherever she went. Whether it was at the grocery store, the cafe, or the park, Thomas was always nearby, watching her. One afternoon, after another close encounter, Mira found a letter in her mailbox. It was a simple, unmarked envelope, but as soon as she opened it, her stomach dropped. The letter inside read, "You can't escape. I'm always watching." The words were chilling. Mira's hands trembled as she held the letter, feeling her breath catch in her throat. This wasn't just a coincidence anymore. Thomas wasn't just some strange man with a crush, he was dangerous. He had been watching her, following her, and now he had left proof. He knew where she lived. He knew everything. Panic gripped her chest as she realized how vulnerable she truly was. Mira thought she could handle this on her own, but now, with the letter in hand, the reality of her situation hit her hard. She couldn't keep running from him, and she couldn't ignore it anymore. She had to do something. That night, Mira didn't sleep. She stayed awake, clutching the letter, her mind racing with thoughts of what Thomas could be planning. Was he going to hurt her? Was he already inside her house, waiting for the right moment to strike? The silence around her was deafening, and the fear gnawed at her from the inside. She didn't know how much longer she could live like this, constantly looking over her shoulder, wondering if today would be the day Thomas made his move. Mira knew she couldn't wait any longer. The letter had made everything clear. Thomas wasn't going to stop. He was coming for her, and she couldn't just sit around and wait for him to make his next move. She had to take control of the situation, but the thought of confronting him filled her with dread. The following day, she went to the local police station. But when she tried to explain everything, how Thomas had been following her, how he had left the letter, she was met with skepticism. The officers didn't take her seriously. They needed more evidence, something solid. They couldn't act on her feelings alone. The frustration and helplessness she felt in that moment were overwhelming. Mira knew that the authorities weren't going to help her. She had to handle this herself. That night, as she sat in her living room, Mira made a decision. She wouldn't let Thomas have power over her any longer. She couldn't keep hiding, couldn't keep being afraid of what might come. She would confront him. She spent the rest of the evening planning her next move. She gathered everything she thought she might need: a phone to record any conversation, a flashlight, a weapon for self-defense. She couldn't rely on anyone else. If Thomas was going to make his move, she would be ready. As the hours passed, Mira stayed alert, listening for any sound that might signal Thomas's arrival. The stillness in the house felt suffocating. She didn't know how long she would have to wait, but she knew she had to face him. She wasn't going to run anymore. Mira was ready for the final confrontation. She wasn't just going to be the victim. Not this time. Mira spent the night on edge, clutching a knife in one hand and her phone in the other. Her heart raced with every creak and groan of the house. She tried to control her breathing, her senses sharpened to pick up the faintest sound. She had left a single light on in the living room, creating shadows that seemed to shift and move, heightening her paranoia. The hours stretched on until, finally, she heard a faint noise at the back of the house. Her heart leaped into her throat as she stood, her hands trembling. The sound of footsteps followed, deliberate and slow, moving toward her back door. She could hear the creak of the wooden porch and the soft scrape of shoes on the planks. Someone was there. Mira positioned herself by the doorway, her phone ready to record. Her pulse thundered in her ears as she strained to hear more. The sound of the doorknob rattling confirmed her worst fear: Thomas was here. She gripped the knife tighter, her knuckles white, and tried to steady her breath. The back door creaked open, and Mira froze. Her phone's camera was already rolling as she leaned just enough to see the figure entering the house. It was Thomas, his silhouette unmistakable in the dim light. He moved with an unsettling calm, his eyes scanning the room as if searching for her. In his hand he held something she couldn't make out, a dark object that glinted faintly in the light. Mira's instinct screamed at her to run, but she held her ground. She couldn't let him get away with this. She stepped into the living room, holding the knife out in front of her. "Stop right there," she said, her voice trembling but firm. Thomas turned to face her, his expression unreadable. For a moment there was silence as they stared at each other. Then he smiled, a cold, twisted smile that sent a chill down her spine. "You don't need to be afraid," he said softly, his voice almost gentle. "I just want to talk." Mira's hand shook, but she didn't lower the knife. "Stay where you are," she said. "I've called the police. They're on their way." Thomas's smile faltered, and his expression darkened. "No, you haven't," he said. "You're alone, just like me." He took a step closer, and Mira's grip tightened on the knife. "I'm warning you," she shouted. Her voice echoed through the empty house. But Thomas didn't stop. He stepped closer, his movements deliberate and slow, his eyes locked on hers. Mira's adrenaline surged. She lunged forward, slashing at him with the knife. Thomas stumbled back, caught off guard, and the object in his hand fell to the floor with a clatter. It was a small crowbar. He looked down at the blood seeping through his shirt, his expression a mix of surprise and rage. "You think this is over?" he hissed, clutching his side. "You'll never be free of me." But Mira wasn't backing down. She grabbed her phone and ran toward the front door, dialing 911 as she went. Thomas staggered after her, but his injuries slowed him down. She burst out of the house and into the street, screaming for help. Lights flickered on in the neighboring houses, and voices called out in confusion. Thomas hesitated in the doorway, realizing he was exposed. He turned and disappeared into the darkness, leaving a trail of blood behind him. The police arrived minutes later, and Mira handed over the video footage she had recorded. They searched the area but couldn't find Thomas. His blood trail led to an abandoned car parked a few blocks away, but he was gone. In the weeks that followed, Mira struggled to regain her sense of safety. She moved out of the house and into a new apartment in a different town. The police assured her they were doing everything they could to find Thomas, but he remained at large. Months passed, and the memory of that night began to fade, though it never truly left her. Mira knew she had survived something terrible, but the scars, both physical and emotional, would stay with her forever. One evening, as she sat in her new apartment, she received a letter in the mail. Her blood ran cold as she opened the envelope and saw the familiar handwriting. "You can't escape. I'm always watching." Mira realized the nightmare wasn't over. Thomas was still out there, waiting, and she knew she would never truly be free.